So as we head into the Cop21 in Paris, it's a very difficult moment. It's a really high stakes moment. Let's go back before the attacks in Paris and just remember what was happening. We know from the people behind the UN process itself that all of these voluntary commitments that the governments of the world are bringing do not add up to the kind of emissions reductions that science is telling us we must have just to have a decent chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. So we start from a position where the governments are gathering, especially the governments of the rich world, of Europe, of the United States. They want to go, the world leaders are meeting at the beginning of the COP rather than the end, which tells us that they are going to get together and strike the bones of a deal near the beginning of the summit. This is what a lot of people think. And we already know that their commitments are insufficient. So their goal is to strike a deal, voluntary, non-binding, and declare victory and move on. And the challenge for the climate movement around the world, where in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, 6 years since Copenhagen, has really been connecting movements of the Global South with environmental NGOs and other activists in the Global North. We've seen a lot of new connections made, civil society from the Global North directly supporting and showing solidarity to countries in the Global South who are in a big bloc called the G77, which is actually, I think, 134 countries, who are really demanding climate justice, the payment of the climate debt, that the rich countries fulfill their historical obligation because it was a couple of hundred years of burning carbon that built the wealth of our rich countries in the North, and yet now we're demanding that the countries of the South develop in a different way. We have to transfer the resources and the technology to allow them to do that, to go past fossil fuels instead of through fossil fuels. So we've seen these alliances where civil society has really been supporting those governments of the Global South and those movements in the Global South that are demanding not just climate policy, not just climate action, but climate justice. And this is a very important dynamic. I was in Warsaw at the last COP, and there was a walkout of countries of the Global South because the negotiations were going nowhere. And they managed to do it in large part because they had a whole bunch of people waiting outside the conference center, activists from all over the world who were supporting them. So there's a very dynamic process between the countries of the Global South and civil society. And there were massive marches planned on November 29th at the beginning, on December 12th at the end, one to show the strength of people around the world who are going to demonstrate in solidarity with those in Paris, that we were not satisfied with the commitments that the governments were bringing, and the other, November 12th, at the end of the COP, to have the last word, to make sure that the world knew that if the deal was insufficient, as we know it will be, that social movements were able to say, this is not enough, this is not a victory, this is not a triumph, that the leaders want to tell that story. We weren't going to let them. And then the attacks happened in Paris, and the French government, I think it's now very fair to say, with breathtaking cynicism, said, life must go on, we will have football matches, we will have Christmas markets, but we cannot have dissent. So they canceled all these marches. And now I think activists from around the world who are coming to Paris are really struggling to say, well, how can we make our voices heard? I think that some people will go to the streets anyway. It's going to be extremely dangerous for them because of the emergency powers that the French government has granted itself, the house arrest we've already seen that they're placing some activists under. And yet, as Naomi has pointed out in some recent articles, the dynamic at the COP is not like the G20 or the G8, where you have civil society banging on the door outside saying, you elites are inside striking deals, we are opposed to this whole process. The COP has always been a much more dynamic flow of pressure from the outside, of civil society events, of marches, yes, but also of panels and of meetings, and the people from inside the conference coming outside to share experiences and going back in. And so the French government has cut these worlds off. And so now we're struggling to get creative about how we can have a voice in the process and how we can balance this narrative that they want to tell. And at the same time, I think some of us are feeling that the world has changed again. We're having these 9/11 flashbacks when the subject was changed. Everything we were talking about, whether it was globalization, now it's climate justice, no. Now we're just going to talk about terrorism. Now we're just going to talk about war. And we have to remember the climate connections with war. That the drought in Syria for the 6 years before the Syrian civil war began was the worst drought they ever had, displaced more than 1 million people who left the countryside and went to the city, created, some of that created the conditions in which the civil war erupted. This is not a left-wing conspiracy theory. John Kerry has spoken about the climate dimension of the Syrian civil war many times, but also that the climate process of a real climate process, of climate justice, where the rich world actually acknowledges its historical responsibility for the crisis that we all face, could be the grounds for creating peace. For the climate deal, if it was real, could be a peace deal. So we can't give up this conversation. We can't let them change the channel. And while at first I personally was really distraught and depressed, as we enter the period of the COP, I'm starting to feel like this movement, it has real momentum, and momentum doesn't just disappear in a minute, especially because we lived the crisis of 9/11. We lived the crisis of 2008. We lost our moments to put forward our agenda in the moment of crisis, and this time I really hope and I believe that people have seen this movie before, and we're not going to let it play out the same way again.